Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Infrastructure Strategies webinar. This is the second webinar in a series hosted by Mott MacDonald, aimed at sharing learning and best practice across the key ICS areas. My name is Kerry Harding. I'm the London and South East Healthcare Lead and will be chairing today. We have an exciting agenda prepared and excellent speakers who are all going to approach today's topic from their individual experiences. This event is scheduled for 1.5 hours. During the first half of the session, we will have presentations from the panel, and this will be followed in the second half by a question and answer session. However, before we start today, I would like to hand over to Rob, who will explain how today will run.
Thank you, Kerry. So during the presentations throughout the webinar this morning, please feel free to use the chat to post your questions. And I've just dropped some information into the chat box that you can see. And obviously we'll address them once we get to the Q&A. If you see a question that you think is really good or is similar to one that you want to ask, then please like it and give it a thumbs up, so then we can see which ones are most popular come the Q&A. Thanks, Phil. We really want to encourage a frank and sort of open discussion. So while we'll be recording the presentations and sharing that after the event, we'll pause the recording when it comes to the Q&A for that discussion to allow for Chatham House rules. Also, you'll all also notice that to ensure for a smooth experience, you will have joined with your microphones muted, and this is just to minimize background noise for the speakers. However, please feel free to leave your cameras on if you feel comfortable. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, or you're struggling to hear us, try to, if you can, drop something into the chat, and then we'll assist you as quickly as we can. Anyway, without further ado, Kerry, it's back to you to get us started.
Thanks, Rob. So most, if not all of you, will be aware that following the NHS requirement for STP estate strategies and subsequent checkpoint estate strategies in 2018 and 19, NHS England and NHS Improvement published Integrating Care, Next Steps to Building Strong and Effective Integrated Care Systems Across England in November 2020. Infrastructure is a key enabler to deliver in delivering transformation in health and care services, and to support best use of assets, facilitate collaboration and improve efficiencies. There is now a request for ICSs to develop system-wide infrastructure strategies. This will set out an ICS's shared estate and infrastructure commitment and provide a roadmap to support integrated working across partner organisations, including local authority and third sector. An infrastructure strategy must represent an enabler to delivering new models of care, supporting recruitment and retention and digital first, providing savings and making efficiencies across the health and care system to improve outcomes whilst providing positive social impact. As a system, infrastructure is diverse, and by understanding the population health needs of a community and the infrastructure that is available across the system, opportunities for innovation, transformation and empowering staff and residents will emerge. It is important to remember that an ICS infrastructure strategy goes further than an estate strategy. Although estate strategies developed by partners across the ICS are key to developing the infrastructure strategy, this must also align to the ICS clinical, workforce, digital and finance strategies, as well as the overarching ICS strategy. The importance of including wider public sector estate and infrastructure and local authority plans, including growth trajectories, must also not be overlooked. The strategy must support population health management and consider how anchor institutions can influence the local economy and the wider determinants of health. This session is intended to provide an insight into the requirements of an infrastructure strategy from those that have experience of preparing and submitting interim versions, and will provide some helpful lessons learned to aid you in developing your own quality strategy. As a reminder, please add your questions and insights into the Q&A throughout the sessions. We will try to cover as many of these off in the final session. Please do not forget to include your name. Joining us on the panel today, we have Paul Fenton, MBE, Strategic Estates Advisor, Suffolk and North East Essex ICB, Nicola Ferron, Director of Estates, North Central London ICB, and Oliver Judges, Executive Director, Borough Council of Kings Lynn and West Norfolk. I will now hand over to Paul to take us through the experience of the Suffolk and North East Essex team in developing their strategy. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Kerry. Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And Rob mentioned about technical difficulties. I've had technical difficulties all morning with my laptop, and it's now told me that it's going to restart in 1 hour and 25 minutes. So no pressure. Thanks very much for the invite, Kerry, Rob, with regards to attending this webinar. And what we'll try and do in the next sort of 15 minutes is to give attendees a flavour of what ourselves at Suffolk and North East Essex ICB have been up to over the last few months, and indeed Nicola will also share her experience, so which I think we can both agree it's been an interesting one over the last few months. So in true Chris Whitty style, I'm going to ask Nord to move to the next slide, please. So as Kerry mentioned, I'm the Strategic Estates Advisor for SNE, Suffolk and North East Essex ICB. After semi-retiring from East Suffolk and North Essex Foundation Trust back in March, I'm now doing a couple of days a week for the ICB to take you through this piece of work. So a little bit about the SNE ICB area. We are around about 1 million in population terms, but an interesting demographic, quite frankly. The south of the patch in North East Essex, called Tendring, is one of the most deprived areas in the country. The north end of the patch towards Southwold and Aldborough is one of the most affluent areas in the country. So we really have got both ends of the spectrum. Certainly, that gives and poses some challenge in respect of services across that area. It's quite a widespread area for a population of 1 million, and as can be seen, around 10%. So over 10% of the population is living in this sort of 20% of the most deprived areas nationally, which, as I say, includes Tendring and Ipswich. On the right-hand side of the slide, that's a list of our ICB partners that constitute the current ICB. A mixture of local authorities, NHS trusts, as you would expect, and health and wellbeing alliances dealing with GP practice and primary care, so on and so forth. So that's a little bit about us. Next slide, please. Kerry's covered a little bit of this, but the context really of the estate's infrastructure strategies is following some work that was done a couple of years ago and around the new hospital programme in respect of ensuring that the NHS has a robust and comprehensive estate infrastructure strategy for the next 20 years. It is fair to say that actually most estate strategies within ICB areas are formulated from NHS providers' estate strategies, almost in a cut and paste and putting together a single document in what was then called an estates workbook, as Kerry said, back in 2019. But 11 ICBs, 7 in the counties, 4 in London, have been part of a national pilot. Suffolk and North East Essex have been part of that pilot to develop these estates infrastructure strategies. The view is to produce a document from those 11 pilot ICBs to form some guidance for the remainder of the 42 ICBs, i.e. to the 31 ICBs that's left to complete the estates infrastructure by the end of the year. Each of the strategies needs to include any significant projects that require public funding, and we are told that when we all submit our final versions, all 42 ICSs for the estates infrastructure strategy by the end of the year, this would constitute and form a single document, an overall NHS estate strategy, which the DHSC and NHS England will use in regards of HM Treasury funding from April 2024. There were some requirements set by NHSE, that is that this should encompass a true health system planning collaboration piece of work, that it supports a reduction in backlog maintenance provides investment in integrated care and maximises the sharing of assets, even if that does mean disposing of unused and underutilised estate. So that's sort of the background of the work. McDonald have been heavily involved with this piece of work since its inception, helping the 11 ICBs as part of the pilot scheme get this work underway. Next slide, please. So the first iteration of our strategy includes those services, acute mental health, community primary care, and the ambulance service. It's anticipated that future iterations will include the services you can see on the screen. I think some of those are going to be relatively easy to capture. I think the social care element and public health element is going to be quite difficult to capture, but that is where we are, I guess, setting our goals for the next couple of years in a number of iterations to our final version. Next slide, please. So the context of the strategy, it's a traditional makeup of the strategy. So it's the where are we now, where do we want to be, and how do we get there. The where are we now, I think we'll talk about this a little later in the slide pack with regards to lessons learned, but we've been quite heavily engaged in ascertaining baseline data for the estate. So we've got a pretty good overview of the condition, of the location of our estate. So I think the where are we now, I think we feel as though we've got that pretty well covered. The where do we want to be follows our joint forward plan over the next 5 years, the digital and technology strategy, workforce strategy, and those priorities and objectives, and of course the green plan and so on and so forth. The how do we get there is the more interesting thing. That's going to require some work, and I think that's where we're concentrating the next 6 months before we get to our final version of ascertaining what we actually need to do to get to the end point, our end goal of a sort of a 20-year vision. And much of that is focused around primary care, if I'm honest. I think where we are now is we've just ascertained our 3 Alliance PCN estate strategies. We're working through those, you see those later on the slide there. And they're giving some interesting figures and requests that are coming through. And then our strategy also deals with the next steps. We've been asked to produce some local actions, some national actions, to feed up to NHS England, and also dealing with the outstanding information. We had a number of bits from our first iteration, which were still awaiting completion. That was the joint forward plan, some demand capacity modelling, and the PCN estate strategies, and also a prioritised investment plan. Again, all of those will be fed into the next iteration. Next slide, please. So where are we now? We operate our service from around 265 operating sites. We have a GIA of around 381,000 square metres, of which 327,000 of those are freehold and the remainder as leasehold, predominantly with NHS property services and community health partnership. Next slide, please. Our backlog maintenance is interesting. I won't go through the figures, you can see them on screen. Our critical infrastructure risk is 97 million, but 74 million of this is concentrated around West Suffolk Hospital. West Suffolk Hospital, as you know, is one of those hospitals that was constructed during the 1970s using the rack plank effect, and you will know of the new hospital programme that has now dedicated a number of billions to rebuilding, I think, 7 rack plank hospitals. But if we took away the critical infrastructure risk from West Suffolk Hospital, once that is completed, it leaves us with an assumed critical infrastructure risk of around 23 million. Now, what I'm going to say is potentially, could be slightly controversial, but what I would say is actually the backlog maintenance figure for this year, bearing in mind this is ERIC data from 21-22, I think when the ERIC data was released in 22-23, both regionally and nationally, that backlog maintenance figure is going to significantly increase. If you purely took construction costs and the increase in construction costs, inflation effect over the last sort of 12 to 24 months, that's going to increase anyway. But of course, there is, I guess, a little fallout from the new hospital program and the time frame, the new time frame allocated for some of those schemes. And I think in a post-COVID world, now that we're back to business as usual, there are a number of trusts that are ascertaining 6 passes surveys. So I'm anticipating that figure is going to be significantly more for our ICB when the ERIC data is released later in the year. Next slide, please. I won't go through this slide, but this just gives you a little bit of information with regards to estate performance and where we are in the mix in respect to the model hospital data. We are predominantly above the benchmark figure in a number of areas, and I'll address what we believe we can do about that in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So where do we want to be? Well, the vision for the estate and the key objectives and the priorities have been developed as part of the ICS Integrated Care Strategy and the Joint Forward Plan. And as Kerry said at the start of this webinar, is informed by the digital data technology, the workforce strategy, and the rest of those that you can see in the list. So it's quite a diverse and wide-ranging number of documents that have informed our estate's infrastructure strategy. And I think that's what's made it fundamentally different to a traditional NHS provider's estate strategy. Next slide, please. So our estate objectives and priorities over the next 5 years are as follows. Estate planning. We want to develop a more effective estate management arrangements through increased collaboration. I think it varies from ICB to ICB in respect of collaboration between providers. There are those that are clearly showing progress with working together as an integrated health system, and that's producing some real benefits. And there are those ICBs that meet once a month and perhaps smile sweetly at one another, yet go back to their own trusts and continue working on their, I guess, siloed approach to what they believe is integrated health. So I think there's much more to be had in estate planning. Oliver will join you later in this webinar and talk about local authority approach. But we are within the SNE ICB heavily into the One Public Estate agenda and working with our local authority colleagues. That adds some real benefits. Developing the primary care estate strategies, really important. It is fair to say that since I joined the ICB, the constant discussion from primary care is they felt as though they have been ignored for a number of years. The big monies have gone across to the acute sector, and I guess during the COVID period that to some extent is correct. We've certainly seen some nice and shiny buildings and projects that have occurred within the acute sector that are now visible to those in the primary care sector, and maybe some end going in there. But certainly we've got a large issue here with regards to primary care estate strategies developing for a future model of care. As a future system, to work as a system to ensure the infrastructure underpins new ways of working, to develop those centres of excellence, and also meeting the future demands from increasing population, working intrinsically with the local authorities to understand the local development plans, the proposed housing growth, so on and so forth. And maybe controversially, some discussion around the ownership and management of properties. We believe that actually that needs a review. The ICBs, as you know, since the 1st of July last year, can now legally own properties. I know a number of ICBs are now exploring that, and ourselves are one of those. Next slide, please.
Can I ask you to wrap up, Paul? Thank you.
I'll be as quick as I can. So how do we get there? Again, I won't go through all of these, but these are a number of initiatives that we are now working through to ascertain some level of information to develop a strategy and deliver it for our aspirations for the future. Next slide, please. And again, I'm sure these slides will be shared, but that is a direct extract from our document, just to endorse, I guess, some of the work that we believe now needs to happen in regards to further healthcare estate integration. Next slide, please. We also believe that actually there is some work to be had with regards to use of resources for the ICB around our NHS providers, certainly in capital development, project management, and a look at maybe a system-wide approach to facility services and estate and FM contract management. And certainly there are huge benefits to be had in some of the logistics arrangements if we can get together within our ICB area with our NHS providers and start to work this through. Next slide, please. So our next steps, again, I won't go through these in details, but we've got a number of local actions that we're now working on, looking at backlog maintenance to ensure the ICB has some monitoring and assurance through to its ICB Estates Committee, and looking at some of the primary care estate strategies to start helping our primary care colleagues in developing those. Next slide, please. National actions. There is no single point of the truth, quite frankly, with regards to estate area information. It's held in SHAPE, it's held in ERIC, it's held in model hospitals and CAFM systems. So some of these actions we're pushing up to NHS England to say, we think you need to review these. Review of the national approvals process. We know that can take some time to get this status through the approvals process. Health system planning. We think guidance should change to ensure a health system approach design rather than individual providers developing their estate. And primary care estate ownership, as I've mentioned, we strongly believe that needs to be looked at. And lastly, some guidance on the impact of IFRS 16. If you want to know what IFRS 16 is, I'll leave someone else in the call to explain that. It's having a financial impact upon the trust's ability to lease children. Next slide, please. And the lessons learned so far: start early, don't underestimate the complexities and the challenges. This has been a bit like herding cats, quite frankly. Certainly when we first started this. Get the collection and analysis of the estate information, ensure engagement, and ditch the scepticism and suspicion of the process. Health system planning is the way forward, and actually it's incumbent upon all NHS providers to sit around the ICB table to share information and actually ensure that stakeholders share that process on the drafting iteration of the IS internally. They have to ensure this is signed off by. And I think the estates and facility services across the RCS offer significant opportunities for the public purse. But above all, this is a health system approach to a strategic estate planning and management, not a group of people that then go off and work on their silos. We've got to look at a health system approach when we're looking at our use and the planning of our estate. Next slide, please.
I think that's you done, Paul.
That was it. Good.
You're starting to enjoy yourself, aren't you? Just a quick question, if I may. You mentioned in your presentation that the review of the 11 strategies in the pilot would inform guidance to be issued to all of the ICBs. Were you given any guidance or parameters at the outset of the pilot, or was the development purely based on experience of writing similar documents and kind of trial and error as you were working your way through?
Great question, Kerry. I think a couple of things really. Mott MacDonald were at the inception of this, as I said, and there was certainly discussions. Mott MacDonald arranged data packs for the 11 ICBs in respect of the estate, and there was the NHS England requirements of what they wanted to see within these infrastructure strategies in a fairly loose way. But I think actually the learning has been with the 11 ICBs that have developed I guess what does good look like. And I think it's fair to say my intelligence on the network tells me that we've all approached it slightly differently. Some have been like us, sort of heavy in the sort of the where are we now to get a real look at a real grasp of the estate that we've got. Others have tend to do that light touch and move more into sort of where do we want to be, how do we get there. And I think it's a combination of bringing those together which has given the guidance for the other 31 ICBs to follow. So I think it's built a little bit on experience. It's built a little bit on discussion with stakeholders around the ICB table within the ICB Estates Committee of what we believe we wanted to be in there, and it's a little bit sort of steered by NHS England and Matthew Warden's team, who have been quite frankly brilliant in this, to help us along the path. So I think in summary it's been a bit of a shared learning, quite frankly, to get us where we are. It'll be interesting to see the final iterations.
Okay. And as I say, I don't know, I'm not expecting you to have the answer, but I'm just wondering whether emerging out of here might be some kind of place where everyone can kind of drop into to share that learning as everyone's developing their way through. I know there's various different elements in the NHS system where you can have those kind of forums to talk to each other, but it sounds like that would be really helpful because some of this learning feels invaluable. Thank you so much, Paul. That was really interesting, really helpful. I will now hand over to Nicola. So Nicola is going to provide an insight into the experiences of the North Central London ICB. Over to you, Nicola.
Great, thank you, Kerry, and thank you, Paul. That's a really interesting overview for Suffolk North East. North Central London, for my next slide, just gives you an illustration. We're a typical London ICS. We have all the things you'd have expected, a younger population than average, more diversity, higher deprivation rates, but also greater pockets of affluence. So all of the issues that we're all tackling. We've got a number of priorities. Part of the issue, isn't it, is trying to manage all those many priorities and how that plays into estates. Summary on the right-hand side just really highlights from our perspective in North Central London the range of issues around stakeholders. We have got 182 practices, which actually is relatively small compared to many. There's been quite a lot of consolidation. Our big challenge in North Central London is managing 12 trusts, of which a number are specialist trusts, but are hosted by NCL. So within that, we have the 5 boroughs that we are working with. So in many ways, a very typical London profile, and I know many of you in the room today are from London, so really good to see you all. So my next slide, really just building a little bit on what Paul has talked about. I wanted just to pick out some key messages at the beginning, which I'll also pick up at the end. I thought I'd start with some of the challenges around those key messages to start with. We, as was Suffolk North East Essex, we were one of the pilots, and really the experience of that showed us this is blooming hard work. These things do not happen by themselves. We were lucky enough to be able to set aside one of our quite experienced estates team to focus on this for 3 months. And we have had really benefited from the strategic estates team in NHS E&I to help us with that. So I know Carla works with a number of you here, so I need to call out the work that she and that team did to support us. So firstly, challenge is really hard work. Secondly, it's about how do we sort of consolidate some of these messaging for a state, the sort of so what point. So we've done a lot of work in NCL around population health improvements. There's some really good data. There's some really strong analysis, but so what for states? So that's been one of our challenges, is really condensing some of those big strategic themes into implications around what is quite a tight estate strategy. shining a light on some quite hard truths. I think Paul mentioned. I'll come on to that in a minute. But once you've surfaced these issues, you need to work out how you're going to tackle them. And really our estate strategy and moving to an infrastructure strategy has helped us to do that. Again, picking up Paul's point, how to bring everybody into the tent. We've got these 12 trusts, all of which have individual priorities. Many of them have individual estate strategies. Our challenge has been bringing them into this as a process. And I think one of the key points for us in the challenge point is how do we avoid this being seen just something, yes, the NHS does, and it's then parked. So we have wanted to really focus this on delivery and to show how we are going to use our capital to invest in that delivery. So those are some of the big picture challenges. Just very briefly, I'll talk you through where we got to in terms of our last update in June on the next slide. Again, very much picking up the points Paul's talked about. The where are we now, really trying to underline to our partners there's been some really good progress locally. Still a tall mountain to climb, but we are in those foothills. Quality, again, an issue for us, picked up by Paul. I'll pick up on that in a minute. The drivers, well, as I've just said, there are so many priorities that we're all trying to tackle. So which are those priorities and which play out in estates? And then how to get there in a current document on the top right hand corner, two really important points. Priority, priority, priority. That's what has to play out to our strategy, and we have to be allocating resource to be able to get there, both of which are really important on the journey. But we also have to be really organised, don't we? And I think that's one of the things the NHS is both good and not so good at, is how do we organise those many stakeholders so that we're taking people with us on the journey. So my next slide was really just trying to highlight two partners that we're not doing this from a standing start. We have a focus on delivery. We have, and Paul mentioned it, so we have set aside 5% of our overall capital envelope to invest in primary care. That's been a really useful and symbolic first step. So we wanted to play that back to both our trust partners in terms of what benefits are coming through from that, but also councils. The importance of we cannot do this without collaboration, and collaboration has brought some of those good results, and that we need to get better at communicating both the issues, the priorities, and the opportunities. So my next slide just picks up some of those challenges, reflecting similarly to what Paul was talking about. So we have 121 million of backlog across our 12 trusts. That is a serious issue for us. That is critical backlog. That is fire. That is M&E. That is covered structural. We haven't got a rack issue, but there is a significant problem that we need to manage and need, importantly, to understand better. On the primary care side, it's a similar story in some ways. Over a quarter of our patients are seen in primary care estate that is not fit for purpose. Small, poor quality, does not allow the sort of collaboration and integration that we need. And some of our boroughs are way worse than that. So one of our boroughs is up to 50%, one of our boroughs is significantly better. So that point around hard truths has played out in this data. So my next slide just picks up, I thought would be useful to give you the a little bit of the national feedback that we had from our estate strategy and how that's playing into our infrastructure strategy. So the feedback we had was that it was too local care based. We had focused heavily on really trying to create a narrative around primary and community, which to some degree we had done, but we needed to bring those 12 providers into the tent. More on that in a minute. We needed to ensure that we had a stronger and comprehensive investment plan. Again, Paul mentioned that. I'll come up on that in a minute. Really important, though, we needed to make sure that we had BAU and that critical backlog within the document, within the process that we're doing. Completely critical, again, how do we wrap digital and imaging into this? And again, we've just talked about how do we feed this into our December review. So we are now in our phase of delivering our infrastructure strategy, reflecting both that national feedback, but also the local feedback, which is just on the next slide. The important point here is, and I think this is this is always the balance we have between the national and local system. We need to find a way of making this owned by NCL and underpinning all that we do. Therefore, how do we get that reach back to our clinicians, to our clinical strategy, to our population health, and to those priorities? I see a question. That therein lies the issue. How do we better, therefore, articulate and prioritise investment? How do we describe those new models of integrated care, physical and mental? How do we demonstrate that we are bringing digital into the core of all that we do, with that point around efficiency and future proofing? And how do we understand and deal with and plan for some of those backlog implications? So what I will do next is just talk through our next steps, and then I'll pick up a little on the investment plan just for the last couple of minutes. So our next version, which I've outlined here, I think the key point that I wanted to highlight here is that we are trying to chunk up our capital envelope, the ICB capital envelope, between the 5%, relatively small, but a starter for primary care. We are looking to set aside a specific percentage to go into strategic capital. The remainder will go into backlog, and we're doing quite a lot of work around quantifying that backlog. And like Paul, we don't believe 122 million is realistic. How are we mitigating that? So the important point, I think, for today is really getting this to be a finance director, an estates director, and a partner organisation. So really raising it onto that ICB agenda. We are led by a finance director and making it as much owned by them as it is by us. Recognising this is also a journey, we are not going to be producing the final document, but we will be producing something that we hope looks more mature than the one that we've delivered so far. So thank you. Yes, next slide just really picks up the investment planning process that we are doing, which some of you, particularly in London, will recognise it's a similar process to what we did elsewhere. So we are going through a process of asking the providers to identify both BAU and strategic asks over a very variety of timeframes for estates, IT, imaging and backlogs. What we will be asking to do is to identify one strategic priority and their critical backlog, what they are looking at mitigations around that. So what that's highlighting is that we are not taking as ICB responsibility for all of this. What we are doing is we've been clear that the boards and the trusts have their own responsibilities, but using capital strategically in order to be able to invest in some of those strategic priorities and ensuring that trusts are held to account for their backlog mitigations. So that's the first exercise. That then goes through picking up a strategic priorities. So we have a clinical estates lead, we have an SRO, we have our transformation executive director and our director of place in a steering group who will help us identify those priorities for NCL. There will be some testing, and then we will get to a point theoretically by the end of the year, assuming that December is the end point, to get that signed off by the LCID, so by our local care board, by our estates board, and by EMT and our ICB board, which is the process we did for our June output. So highlight, this is best 80-20, but it's the journey that we're on with strong leadership, strong estates leadership, but also finance and clinical leadership to get us to a point where we can get behind decisions around capital planning. My next slide just really plays back those key messages. And I suppose where I wanted to get to at the end of this is that identify some key messages, challenges. The positives, I think, there are three I would take away from this. The process for this infrastructure planning is as important as the output. Secondly, it has given us a profile and a relevance in the ICB as it has evolved. And I think that is important to recognise. Thirdly, it's helped us to shine the light on some of those hard truths and ensure that capital is being targeted strategically at some of those areas of risk. And I think probably most importantly, and coming on to Ollie, who's going to follow me, this has given us a document and a process that we've been able to work with, share, collaborate. And we've probably had 250 contributors to our estate strategy. And that has given us a great baseline to work with in terms of our infrastructure strategy. By the time we've talked to trusts, to clinical leads, to local authority partners, to PCNs, primary care, etc. So for us, this has given us a good springboard to get back onto that focus of delivery and how we use our capital to mitigate and to support the transformation and patient outcomes, which is after all what we're here for. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Kerry.
Thank you, Nicola. That's fantastic. And I think clearly it shows the complexities of delivering that infrastructure strategy just cannot be overestimated. And it feels like you've kind of gone for a journey rather than a process during this pilot. Just a quick question from me, if you don't mind. You mentioned quite a lot there about stakeholder collaboration and buy-in. How did you deal with that? And I'm assuming there was the inevitable, what's in it for me? Why would I give my time to this? So how did you deal with that?
Yeah, no, good question, because it sort of sits at the heart of it. I think there's two levels to that. As a bottom up, we took this through all of our local estates forums, our estates board, all of our clinical primary care teams to make sure that it told their story as much as ours. Secondly, we really, I suppose, identified our sort of lead advocates. So how, if we can make it relevant to our ICB chairs, to our finance director, to the clinical leads, to the transformation directors, then it's going to be relevant for others. Clearly not a perfect process, but I think the delivery of the early project and to some degree highlighting the successes and benefits came out of it, and I mentioned CDCs on the slide. That's been a good example of how we've got behind some prioritised projects. Estate was sitting there at the heart and the beginning, and we've delivered some good outcomes from that. So again, building a story around, we're not going to be able to do all that we want, but if we focus and we target and get behind those projects, actually they are achievable and deliverable.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think
Thanks.
that's absolutely key, is it, showing people that there's a real purpose to this. And I think it was you that mentioned as well, it's not just a document that you'll do, put on the shelf, forget about it, come back to it in a couple of years' time, which is really important. Thank you so much, Nicola. That's been brilliant. So we're now going to hand over to Oliver Judges, who will share a slightly different perspective on considerations when developing your infrastructure strategy. Over to you, Oliver.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks, Nicola and Paul, for that. Good to see you all virtually. I'm Oliver Judges, so I'm the Exec Director of Place here in Kings Lynn and West Norfolk. Previously, I've worked within the NHS as a joint role between Surrey County Council and Surrey Heartlands ICS, looking at infrastructure strategies. I've also been a non-exec director and interim chair at Cambridgeshire Community Services Trust. That was for 6 years, finished last month. And previous to that, worked as an interim across the wider public sector. And I've also had a lot of work sort of working for and also being a trustee of charities working within mental health. I'm probably taking a slightly different perspective, and I've seen the question about how did you engage or get engagement with LAs, and hopefully this will start to pull some of that together. But I think it will be a case of actually there's two sides in a lot of senses, and we need to take it into one conversation. And I sort of find that sometimes in the NHS conversation, we're very much embroiled in our NHS and where we are, and there's some real challenges within there. And then on the other side, local authorities are embroiled in what they've got to deal with and the financial situations and things like that. But actually seeing that if we work together, we can actually hit some of these issues in sort of different ways, which in the future can also reduce a lot of the pressure coming forward. And I think the future is key, and that longer term view. So first slide, please, or next slide, please. Thank you. So I won't go into this, but I was just pulling out the fact around sort of developing a vision and a strategic estates vision together is fundamental. Some of the conversations that I've had was a real there tend to be a move towards, yes, we all need to work together and we need to have this one public estate. And then it's felt like it moved back into the traditional NHS way of looking at estate, because of all the pressures that were there. And so capital, etc., is scarce. So we've got to focus on the now. And I think that whole moving forward is really key. And we've got to have those conversations now, because we'll never change what we need to do moving forward if we don't work differently. Next slide, please. So we've talked through, and I think the ones before have talked through what's the business need, how do we add value, what's the current situation, which is absolutely key, and huge amounts of work going in that. What's the desired situation? But one of the key things, and the question in there is how do we deliver change? And when you look at strategy, you've got to think about, it's a long-term plan, in effect. It's there to deliver the what, which is about the vision, mission, and objectives. And we've got to be really clear on what those are and what we're trying to achieve. And then the how is fundamentally important. So the strategic infrastructure sort of plans coming out, and the strategies need to look at very much that long-term vision. What is it that we need to get to? And the how are we going to get there, and how is that long-term plan coming through? The NHS tends to work in years, and so do local authorities in a lot of senses, work in quite short blocks. So it might be a year, it might be 5 years, is almost long-term. We've got to look, I think, more generationally in what's coming through and what do we need for the future state. And the approach is fundamental to this. We tend to work a lot in tactics. So we're looking at short-term focuses on how can we deal with the now, and that's where the real pressure is. That tends to then use up all the money, and therefore we start to lose focus on our long-term plan. So the approach and methodology is absolutely key. If you need to move to the next slide, please. In Norfolk and Waveney ICS, and looking at this, and I've got at the top there NHS vision ? Because when I was looking through, it didn't jump out at me something that just said vision, mission, and objectives, and what we're trying to do as a whole NHS. And I think it's there somewhere, but there's a lot of strategies, but nothing that just says this is what we're going to be in the future, and this is how health looks. And I know that can move into that political side as well, but it's key that we have those. Within care systems, obviously there's the mission there, and it's about living longer, healthier, happier lives. And when you look at the goals, being as healthy as possible and telling your story once and being the best place to basically live and work within the health side, that absolutely links to what we're trying to do as a district here and as local authorities. So under place, I look at live, work, play. I look at how we can make the borough a much better place to do all those things. Look at economic prosperity, regeneration, but we also look at deprivation, how we can manage that and create better places. That coordination, collaboration, again, is fundamental. And a lot of districts, a lot of boroughs, a lot of different organisations don't do that particularly well. So they work with their own objectives and don't look more widely. And so we need to do that better. And also housing. I mean, under my team, we have a housing team. They work in looking at housing planning and how we can develop that. So it's getting the right housing in the right places. And some of that will be things like looking at, we know that you've got issues in hospitals around delayed transfer of care. I know that takes up probably a couple of wards in some cases locally. And therefore, how do we help manage some of that? And that's working with each other to look at how we can plan things moving forward. And is there a need for extra care, step down sort of facilities, supported living, etc.? And how do we make that happen? Next slide, please. So looking at the how and the approach, one of the key things that I tend to see is missing in a lot of strategies is that principles of how we work together. So when we engage with stakeholders, how is it that we're going to engage? And I've heard a lot of things in my past sort of in meetings that I've been in, but even now as well, you hear people that say, well, we're not here to deliver the NHS's or solve the NHS's issues. We're here to do this. And on the other side, you'll have the NHS saying, well, they need to do X and it should cost this much because we're helping them deliver what they do. And it shouldn't be them and us, because the people that we're working for is one community and one set of people that sit at the bottom of this very complex thing that sits above them. So we need to work out, how do we get those principles to work together? and how do we do that and take that forward? And that's sitting down, talking through and understanding. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is really just saying, understanding we work in very complex structures and they're different structures. We've now got ICSs, which brilliantly has a B and a P, which has actually separated the partnership and the business aspect. And so sometimes that makes those financial conversations more difficult because the financial side will drive things in a lot of senses. So again, how do we work through those? But we do have place, and we have place that sits beneath that and place boards. And again, that local perspective, that working with local authorities within those place areas and working through the local issues that we have in a very open, transparent way is absolutely key moving forward. And I've put a slide there to show this sort of tiered system. You've got different systems for local authorities that can be quite complex. It's just understanding those different services, who delivers what, and making sure we're tying everyone in that same conversation. Next slide, please. So as part of that and understanding the current situation, it's understanding we know this is a really difficult place that we're in, and actually the economy as well, when we look at the environment, is a very difficult place. We know that there's backlog, we know that there's pressures around social care as well that sits with, let's say, counties, or in those metropolitan type boroughs, and we've got to work together to help resolve some of those. You've got maintenance issues and backlog issues. There's obviously the pandemic recovery that we're still going through. A lot of people say, well, that doesn't exist anymore because it's gone. We know it hasn't gone. We see that the pressures within the NHS, but we also see that now more within social care and mental health and the conditions that have come on from that. So again, how do we manage that? And of course, there's the financial and people challenges coming through. There's also culture. We work in very different cultures within our organizations. So again, we've got to sit down and work through that and talk through how that, how we can bring that forward. And there's also system fatigue. And I think that's the case certainly in local authorities. There's a lot of change that's happened over the years, but absolutely in the NHS, there's been change after change after change. Now we're in ICSs, and how does that work? And there's financial pressures coming through. So again, it's that sitting down, talking through, engaging stakeholders to do that. Next slide, please. The other thing that we've really got to remember in the conversation, and I know this has been touched on in previous presentations, is we've got to think about the challenges that the people are facing in the communities that we're working for. So when we look at deprivation and wider determinants of health, which ultimately lead into a lot of these pressures, you can see different areas that we could actually start using those tactics, or nudge theory as some call, to make small changes which will start to make changes moving forward. So in a local area in North Lynn, here in Kings Lynn, we've got a community that is in the lower sort of percentage of deprivation. So that's health deprivation and disability areas, obviously income as well, multiple deprivation, employment deprivation, so a little bit better, but there, so that's the bottom left, skills and training. And then that leads on to there's increased crime and things like that in that area. And you get into this vicious circle within communities where if you don't start to solve some of these points, it will lead on to others. And that ultimately leads into health, etc. going forward. To move on to the next slide, please. So one of the key things that's been debated a lot is around housing. And we've been doing a lot of projects here in housing, looking at how we can create better communities. So we've got a programme called Creating Communities, which is looking to go in and help inform communities where they can access different services going forward. And again, we need to include the NHS, etc. in that, but there are different links coming through from something called Ask Lily, which I'll come on to shortly. But also when we're delivering housing, we're looking at the density and making it actually less dense. So we're creating greener spaces, etc., to try and drive that forward. And as we can see, some of that those deprivation indices, nothing to do with me because I've only been here for 5 months, but has started to flow through within these. But it takes a long time to impact on the others. So it's that planning, it's that thinking forward and how we can take that forward. Next slide, please. So we've got to really think about how we can sort of deliver some of these services and how we can work at this level. And again, you know, if I look at the health deprivation and disability side, there was an article on the BBC recently that you picked up. You know, the average life expectancy is 7 years less in this area, 5 years less or 5.5 years less for females. And you can see the different diseases and different elements that feed into that. So respiratory, can't get my words out, respiratory disease is 111% above average. You know, that it just shows key indicators that we should be focusing on and how we do that. And we know that that will then lead to increased pressures and queues outside hospitals if we don't do that. So let's start targeting around that and let's have the conversation around that. Next slide, please. We know all
Oliver, I
this.
can ask you to wrap up. Sorry to interrupt.
I will go very quickly now. We know all this. There's been a lot of reports over decades, Marmot Review, etc. We've had the Fuller Stocktake. We've had others looking into it. And Financial Times came out about the fact that growing resources being used to deliver sick people, but rather than prevention. And I think, again, we need to start looking at prevention. Otherwise, long term, we're not going to hit those goals. Next slide, please. Actually, and there was a report by the King's Fund that also looked at how you integrate and sort of work with district councils. Useful to read and useful to look at. It looks at the ICS and ICB perspective as well. Next slide, please. So to me, it's about decomplicating the structure. It's about looking at how we can work more locally and think about the individuals we serve. And it's very much about supporting well-being and making sure that people have one point of contact to be able to get to their services rather than having to go to those multiple contacts. Next slide, please. We talked about the one public estate. I won't go too detailed into that, but we've got to include that in our infrastructure strategies. And I think we've got to also include a piece around local authorities and get local authorities to input. I think it can be very difficult to do that, but we need to make sure that engagement there. And if you can get contributions from local authorities, or certainly those networks, then I think that will make a big step in where we need to go. It supports national objectives. It supports the wider place outcomes for what I'm trying to deliver. It coordinates net zero targets, all those different things that come with it. So we should be doing it. And we've talked about offices and things like that. To me, that's an easy one. We should be working together to make sure that we can collaborate around office accommodation and that side. Next slide, please. So here in Kings Lynn, going to wrap up very quickly. We have leisure centres that already engage, and we know a lot of places do engage around this, so musculoskeletal, but rehabilitation, cardiac, cancer, neuro, rehab, and wellness referral scheme, something around weight loss and etc. Again, trying to engage on that more. The key thing is a lot of these aren't well used. So we need to make sure that those are promoted and those are used. And if they're not delivering the right things, let's change them to make them deliver the right things. We've also got the Lily services I mentioned earlier, which is a gateway to a number of different services. And we're talking locally with the Place Board, we're talking with the wider NHS as well, looking at how we can use these things more to give a front door and an access for people to make sure they're routed through to the right support services. Next slide, please. And the other side is new hospital programme. What an opportunity in some areas that have got it. And we need to make sure that we put the right things in the right places. So hospitals, they're acutes. We should be looking at those as acutes and emergency care. I always questioned the point that we had outpatients in hospitals. So as an outpatient, you walk into a place that tells you that you're unwell. Actually, it would be quite good to walk into a place that is about wellness and is about rehabilitation and taking that forward. So we can do all that. Plus, there may well be, and it's different areas, funding works in a very funny way, but there is funding that local authorities that can engage with that maybe the NHS can't. So let's think about that as well from a financial point. And next slide, please. So progress is at the speed of trust. Sir James Mackay said that once a long time ago, and I think that is absolutely key. We need to work together. We need to get trust between organisations, and we need to make it work for those commutes going forward. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to show you pictures of Kings Lynn, because tourism is in my portfolio, and Kings Lynn is never promoted necessarily that well. We have a great waterfront. We've got great places. We sometimes have fireworks. We also have a great coastline, which is great for health and well-being as well. So come and visit, come for a walk. It'd be great to show you around. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Ollie, and a plug as well. How's that? Thank you so much. Prevention and empowering people to take greater responsibility for their own health and well-being is a real passion of mine. My feeling is this can only be achieved by wider system collaboration, as you've just explained, and understanding how the health and care organisations can influence the wider determinants of health. I just wonder if you can share with us any experience that you've had where this has been done well.
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it? I've been looking through, and I've been thinking about leisure centres and that sort of side. And there are examples out there. There's a lot of examples of where things like MSK has actually worked closely with leisure centres and used those going forward. But I think there's a real opportunity there. When I look at integration of NHS services in different places, there's one place, and some of you may have come across it, Bromley by Bow, which is a community area, and it's a community group that's set up, and this would probably more link into the primary care side, but it's very much around, it's developed over decades, and Bromley by Bow has changed massively over those decades, a huge amount of regeneration. But this core area is an area of grassland. It's got a park and everything around it. It's got buildings around it, and there's the food bank there. There's also the NHS, GP surgery, etc., primary care. They link very closely in with the local school that was failing. So they all work together. There's a pharmacy that's one of the most, I think it's one of the most technical or techno pharmacies, computerized, that works there, that works with the children, who also are looking either at the chemistry and pharmacology sort of side, or from the IT side. And the GPs, etc., they all work together, so they all talk to each other. And with the food bank, you walk into the site and you talk to people as you go down, because you can't, it's very difficult to find your way to where you're meant to be going. And I was told that's for a reason, because you talk to people, and as you talk to people, you learn things about the area, and you learn about sort of the needs, and they work very closely with the GPs, so they get to understand what's happening in the community. And they've been doing social scribing for 25 years, and that's been community groups working with the local GP services around mental health and around other sort of points, doing the gardening, working up green spaces, etc. And it's a real vibe for a community, and it hits those deprivation things. Crime is low because it starts to self-manage itself, because they have respect for those areas. People understand where there are issues and they see them early on, so they will point people in the right direction. So again, it comes around. I think it's a great example how something, and over a long time, can make a massive impact to a community, and very specific to that community.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I think Bromley has been referred to, as you say, for a number of years, and they just keep on they haven't just left it stale, it just keeps moving, doesn't it? And there's some brilliant case studies out there, I'm sure most people are aware, but yeah, definitely worth looking at case studies. Thank you so much. I'm sure you'll all agree these have been excellent presentations, plenty of food for thought. Please keep submitting your questions, we'll come to these next. But before we stop the recording and head into the Q&A, I'd like to hand over to Rob briefly to let you know about some forthcoming webinars that we've got coming up.
Thanks, Kerry. Thanks to all the speakers. I'll give my one moment to say next slide, please, Norge. Brilliant. So as mentioned at the beginning of the event, this is the second webinar in a 4-part series that we're running. As you can see on the slide, information on the topics and confirmed speakers for the next 2 are there now. So the next event is focused around decarbonisation of not just health but care systems as well. So there's a mixture of ICB and local authority speakers similar to today. That's in September. And then, as you can see, the last one in our series is on digital clinical transformation, which is led by one of our clinicians who developed the first virtual hospital in the UK. So it'll be really interesting to hear about that as well.